Good morning. Thanks for attending our workshop today. This is the Center for Studies in Demography and Ecology's workshop on data management plans for the National Institutes of Health. I'll be presenting that part, and happy to have Jenny Muilenburg, who is a librarian that specializes in data management of all types. And Jenny will be presenting on the Dryad part. This is being recorded, so you might be looking at this recording after the fact. So an overview of what we'll be covering today. First, just what this workshop is about. I'll go into a bit of detail on the new NIH requirements for data management and sharing plans. We'll talk about your responsibilities as a researcher, including what you need to do when writing proposals, what you need to do during the performance period if you get an award, and then what to do after the performance period is complete. I'll introduce a few other online resources, and then we'll talk about options for long-term storage and dissemination of research data at UW. Really fortunate to have an agreement with Dryad for allowing us to store these data repository projects. So this is an overview of the new NIH policy on data management and sharing plans. It's not a complete treatment. So this really isn't an introduction. It's going to be the highlights, the things that after I read a lot of materials and attended a few NIH webinars, these are the highlights that I thought was most important. So undoubtedly there will be things that I've missed, possibly important things that I've missed, but the NIH has a tremendous amount of other resources. It's got a great FAQ that we might look at as we're going along. Another limitation is that specifically I am not addressing genomic data sharing. There's a whole set of regulations and requirements for that. The reason that we decided not to cover that is because CSDE really focuses mostly on the social sciences. And although we have the biodemography lab here, which may get into genomic stuff, the two leads of the biodemography lab agreed that it was really not appropriate to go into the details on genomic data sharing. So if this is something that you're doing or interested in, then I would encourage you to look at the NIH materials on that. And then the last thing that we're going to do in this workshop is introduce the Dryad data repository. So there is a new NIH requirement that is effective January 25th, 2023, which, if there's no doubt, that means that it is now effective for all new research proposals. And all proposals for research funding must include a section on data management and sharing. Proposals that have no data management and sharing plan are, I haven't heard specifically, but I'm going to guess that they are just going to be kicked right out. And they're going to send you back, whoever does the initial review is going to say, there's no data management and sharing plan, so we're not even going to spend our time. It certainly is not going to go to study section for review. I don't know whether this is good or bad. Remember when NIH proposals could be 30 pages? And then they said, no, they must be 12 pages, right? And everybody's going, oh, it's so great. I don't have to write so much. And then they go like, oh no, how am I going to fit everything in 12 pages? So the recommendation for the data management and sharing plans are to be no more than 2 pages. Talk a little bit more about that, but the idea is that you should be able to get most of your plans detailed in 2 pages. This is really important for people that are making the proposals, is that the plans themselves are not visible to peer reviewers unless the funding opportunity announcement specifically has a data sharing focus. Right? So if your proposal is for doing some kind of data sharing, then obviously the data sharing plan would have to be available to peer reviewers. This also means that the plans are not scored on your pink sheets. So, you know, you've got the your aims, and then innovation and all the other sections that you're scored on, you know, your team, and those go into the final score of the grant. But the DMS plan is really something that is either it's adequate or not adequate, and is not scored and doesn't go into the larger score. So why is the NIH requiring this? And I pulled this quote from the URL you can see. Consistent with both the NIH mission to improve public health through research and its longstanding legislative mandate to make available to the public the results of the research activities that it supports and conducts, the NIH believes that the full value of, and this was specifically written for genome-wide, something about that, full value include any data of or X research to the public can be realized only if the data sets are made available as rapidly as possible to a wide range of scientific investigators. I think, you know, particularly the experience that the world went through recently with the pandemic, these vaccines would not have been able to be created unless there was a really rapid and open sharing of research data. And so I think the mission is, I think this is really great. I've always been kind of perplexed by when we get grant funding that we assume that we have succeeded if we have published in peer-reviewed journals. And whether that actually goes back to the public or society is, you know, who knows? So I think this is really a great service. Why is this being required? Alias, how to make peace with these new requirements. So one way of thinking about this, which I would encourage you not to think about it, is just another hoop to jump through or another administrative requirement. Although I'm not going to say that's not the case, that's not the intention. Best way to think about it is that it's a way to increase the impact of NIH-funded research. Taxpayer dollars should be spent wisely and with the greatest effect. And although this really increases the shorter-term burden on individual researchers, in the long run, it really should benefit all researchers, and it should benefit society in general. Now, how many times have you read a paper where you said, wow, I wish the data were available, or I wish that the methods were available in more detail? And I think the intention of this is really to help increase the open science part of what we're doing. Okay, what needs to be shared? Again, this is a quote: recorded factual material of sufficient quality to validate and replicate research findings. This is, I think, really the key part of that is that frequently I read papers and there's just simply no way I'd be able to replicate what they did based on what's written in the paper. And I mean, I'm not meaning to say that the authors are at fault. A lot of times it's just the journals say, you know, you only have this many words and there's only so much that you can put in a paper. So having this requirement, I think, is going to be really great in terms of people getting used to the fact that they're having to share in ways that are replicable. Okay, and then the second part of this is regardless of whether the data are used to support scholarly publications. What this means is if you've gotten money from the NIH, then you have to share, you have to be willing to share this material, whether or not it got published. Now, there are some things that they do not expect you to share, and I don't think that, I think this is up to individual researchers, but there's no requirement of sharing things like lab notebooks or preliminary analyses or peer reviews or any physical objects. So it's really just enough so that that your research can be validated and replicated. There are also limitations on what can be shared. And so there are ethical, legal, and technical considerations. Some examples, and this is not a definitive list, are sometimes with informed consent, particularly if you've worked with an IRB, in the informed consent, there may actually be stipulations about what's able to be shared or not shared. And then this kind of gets into the personally identifiable information or protected health information or other things that are covered by regulations such as HIPAA. Then also there may be explicit federal, state, local, or tribal law and other regulations or policies that specifically prohibit disclosure. There are aspects that are not justifiable for limiting sharing. So if you think that your data set is too small, too bad, you still have to at least share within the bounds of what's expected. Researchers that anticipate the data will not be widely used, that's not sufficient, or data are not thought to have a suitable repository. So if any of these types of stipulations that are your idea about whether you think the data should be shared or not, the best thing to do in this case is to contact the officer that's overseeing the FOA, and then ask them about what specific kinds of things should or should not be shared. I think there's going to be a lot of openness about that because this is it's a new policy, and that the officers themselves are learning as they go. So I think there won't be a lot of backlash if you start asking really directed questions. Okay, this requirement applies to all research generating scientific data, and these include research projects, some career development awards, those are the K series of awards. The resource that I pulled this from specifically said some career development awards, and it didn't say specifically which. There's also these small business funding that honestly, I don't know much about this program, but these programs, if they're funded, must also include the data sharing aspect. Research centers, Jessica, I guess that means us. It does not apply to certain funded activities, particularly if they don't generate scientific data. So those would be the training or T series. So Jessica, you're gonna be happy about that. So we'll have to do it for part of CSDE, but not the other part of it. Fellowships do not need to have data sharing. Construction, conference grants, the G series of resources, or infrastructure programs. So it's really, you can think of it as if you're involved in research that uses and generates data, then you've got to do some kind of data sharing. Okay, I'm going to switch now and get into the responsibilities that researchers have in the proposal stage, during the performance period, and then after the performance period is complete. And this in the proposal phase, there's two things that you'll want to be aware of. One is the data management and storage plan itself that's to be included, and then the other consideration is budgeting. So when you make your proposal, it must include a data management sharing plan, and those must be complete and acceptable. What that actually means, I think, is still a bit unknown. And I think we'll learn more through experience. And I think the NIH is going to learn more through experience about what's complete and acceptable. Recommended to be no more than 2 pages. Now, if you're proposing research that supports a huge amount of activities, so I'm thinking about maybe something like some of the things that IHME has going on, or CSDE, right? We have so many different activities, and we're generating a lot of different data sets that you don't have to be limited to 2 pages, but I think the intention is that it's to be succinct to cover the data that you're going to be generating. There's an example that they have on the website that looks pretty straightforward, and it just shows 2 pages. When you think about it, 2 pages is not a lot. I'm going to zoom in on each of these different sections so you can see it in more detail. So the first element talks about the data type. So these would be the types and amount. Amount, I imagine, meaning count of tables or file size. Not really clear. Item B, scientific data that will be preserved, shared, and the rationale for doing so. So here you're going to describe the actual data sets that you're going to be preserving and sharing. And then listing metadata. So not only do you need to be prepared to share the data, but you should also be prepared to share the metadata. And I think this is really important because if the idea is to make things transparent, able to be validated, and able to be replicated, if you just throw a data set up there without metadata about the characteristics of the data or how the data should be used, then the data will pretty much be worthless. Second element, related tool software and or code. So here, if you were just going to say use off-the-shelf Stata or R for analysis, probably not sufficient just to say that, because clearly you're going to be developing scripts for doing data handling. So I think there's people are going to be required to include code, at least the code that's necessary for replicating the work. And I think this can't really be understated, because really that's probably about 90% of the work that we do is in coding. I mean, so I'm speaking from my own perspective, in which, you know, the studies that I'm working on, or at least my part in the studies, don't include large clinical portions. You know, it's mostly taking secondary data and analyzing secondary data. But code, you'll definitely need to include those. Third element, standards. What common data standards? The great thing about standards is there's so many to choose from, right? So I honestly wouldn't know how to start writing this. So if I was going to make a proposal, probably the first thing that I would do, you know, my experience in writing proposals is I have a lot of experience, and you know, you break up the work across different people. Okay, you write this, I'll write that. Nobody yet that I know has written anything including one of these. So, you know, how to approach this data standards, this is something that I would contact the officer and ask for a little bit more detail. There may also be, there will be more information on the NIH website about these items as time goes on. But I guess obviously, because a lot of these things are new, whereas doing the science is always new, but it's kind of like it's known how to write science, and we're building on things from the past, whereas these data management plans are completely new for most of us. Okay, element 4, data preservation, access, and associated timelines. So Jenny will talk more about Dryad, but you know, what's the repository where they're going to be archived? How will people that are doing similar research be able to find these data sets? And then how long will they be made available? I don't know that there's any requirements for how long, but as a research, I guess in all science things can go stale, but this again is unknown to me. Okay, element 5, access, distribution, or reuse consideration. So here's where you're going to have to wonder whether you have personally identifiable information or protected health information. So there may be factors that affect access, distribution, and reuse. Will access to the scientific data need to be controlled? Like, do you need people to sign data use agreements before using the data? And I think you can have shareable data, and you can require users to sign data use agreements if it's warranted. And then if you do have identifiable information, then you need to explain how you're going to protect that identifiable information. Finally, element 6, who will provide oversight of the data management and sharing? Right. So is this the PI's role, or is it the whoever the data wonk is on the project? Again, I really don't know how to answer this. So I'm trying to be really upfront about the things that I know and the things that I don't know. And you as researchers going into this material are probably going to have a lot of the same questions that I have. There are example. Oh, sorry, so repeat. There's some examples of actual language on the NIH website. So here's an example from element 1, item A, and I'm not really going to read that, but obviously somebody that's doing some kind of genetic work, but just to give you the idea of the kinds of information that they're going to be looking at. And I think there will be, from looking at this, there's an assumption that who is going to be reviewing the data management and sharing plan must have probably expert knowledge in the area of study. So for example, acronyms are often frowned upon or they must be defined in your whole proposal. And a lot of the proposal, they say, should be written for somebody with a high level of knowledge in the area. Obviously, they're not going to make study sections that include people that don't have expertise in what you're proposing. But because of the parsimony of the data management sharing plan, I think that you should write it with the expectation that who's going to be reading it has expert knowledge in your field. If this example is an example that they're willing to share and say this is what your DMS could look like. They have a whole set of templates that are available. And again, these are templates, but I didn't look at them in detail, so I don't know whether they have examples. And I'm hoping that the NIH provides a lot more examples of what will be considered complete and adequate. Just to show you, on the website itself, there are links to all of those different templates. So I think they're trying to be as helpful as they can. Okay, next, budget. The good news is that your budget does allow you to cover costs related to the data management and sharing plans. So it's not like when you write a budget, typically you're going to be itemizing all of the things that you need to request funds to cover. And if there's additional things that you need to do because of this new requirement, you can ask for funds to cover those parts of the research. You cannot request funds that will be spent after the performance period is over. So if you have a data set that you want to make public and it costs X amount per year for a repository to host that, and you think that you're going to be having that public for 10 years, you cannot ask the NIH for 10 years of funding to cover that. Is all of the money of your grant has to be spent within the performance period. So that's the way it is. You cannot fund future data storage costs on an expired budget. And then there are allowable and unallowable costs. So there are certain things that you can ask money for, but other things that you cannot ask money for. Allowable costs include things such as curating data and developing supporting documentation. So if your work in the past was developing data, if you had a grant-funded project that developed a lot of data, but you didn't really worry about sharing it outside of your own research group. But now you have to worry about sharing that outside of your research group. So it would include packaging the data in ways that others could use it and documenting the data in ways that other people could use it. Well, that's something that you didn't have to do in the past that you're going to have to do now. You can ask money to cover those activities. You can ask for money for preserving and sharing data through repositories, but again, only during the performance period. I have no idea what the effects of that are going to be, right? So and then usually the data that you're going to generate for sharing are probably in like the last year of a 5-year R01. So a lot of unknowns here. You can also ask for money for local data management consideration. So if you needed more storage space or another server or something for doing the data curation and development, then you can ask for that. What's not allowable are infrastructure costs, typically included in indirect costs. So if you have with us, I guess at CSDE, we have an IT department that simply covers a lot of stuff. We can't ask for money to cover things that are already included in the indirects. And you cannot include costs associated with the routine conduct of research. For example, costs of gaining access to research data. I believe that costs of gaining access to research data can be included in the overall budget, right? So if you have to buy data from LexisNexis, or there's a cost associated with using CHS data, something like that, you can budget for that, but that is not within the budget for the DMS. Also on the forms, when you are actually doing the last details on the NIH forms, on the R&R budget form, there is you can include a line item for data management and sharing costs. So that's something that they have the items 1 through 7 that are kind of known costs, but you would include in the kind of the open-ended area data management and sharing costs. And then also on the PHS 398 modular budget form, there you would include parts of your, I'm not exactly sure on this, whether the data management and sharing plan goes in this as an attachment. I think once you start looking at the documentation on data management sharing plans, it should be clear how that goes, how that is attached to your proposal. Okay, in terms of budget, the actual data management and sharing plan, that plan itself, that 2-page or more, is not visible to your peer reviewers, but you should include something that's less than a half a page in the budget justification. So if you're asking for additional money to cover data management and sharing plans, then you need to include that in your budget justification, and that part is peer reviewed. And the reviewers may comment on that part of your budget justification, even though they don't know all of the details about your plan itself. So just be aware that that is part of the peer review process. During the performance period, your approved DMS plan becomes a term and condition of your award. So if it's found that you're not sticking to that, then probably bad things could happen to the flow of money. And the data sharing must be implemented no later than, and this is whichever comes first, your first publication or the end of the award period. So if you, in some projects I've been working on, they try to get a publication out within the first or second year about some of the methods development. So if you're going to publish, even on something like that, then your data sharing must be implemented by that time. I imagine in that kind of situation, some of the data that are being developed are still preliminary, and yet they said you don't have to share preliminary data. So a lot of this is still kind of in the area of head scratching. But certainly by the time that your award is completed, then your data sharing must be implemented. And it's, again, because a lot of things change during research, the DMS plans themselves may be updated. If it's found that, oh, there's something that you didn't consider that you need to do more on, or, oh, there's a whole part of this that we actually don't need to do, then that can be an amendment to your plan. But any changes to the plan must be approved by your officer. And the plan is part of the RPPR process, and the plan is reviewed annually. So this is a serious thing in terms of like your performance.
Bill, I have a question. I mean, it sounds like this is the case, but is this review about making sure that you as a researcher are adhering to the original plan that's laid out, or is it what I think would be more appropriate, some of that and also an option to update your plan based on things you have learned through your research?
I believe it's both, right? I believe that if you know, I can't remember any project that I've been on where there isn't some change to either the methods or, oh, wow, the aims really, we can't do the aims as stated. We have to change it a little bit. So there's that part of it. But then there is the part of it of like, okay, how's your research going? You have to tell us every year. You have to include that. So it's both if you have any changes and adherence to your plan. Okay, post-performance, I found nothing on this. And there was no, this is what you must do. So I looked a little bit about closing out of grants, and I found this, that recipients generally must retain financial and programmatic records. That's for financial and programmatic. It's not research data, right? But those must be retained for at least 3 years from the date that the annual report is submitted. So I think again, because this is so new, they haven't really thought through, and they don't want to get themselves into trouble by saying what you must do after the performance period, because then does that mean that they need to fund you? If they're requiring you to do something, can you ask for funds? And you cannot ask for funds to cover things that happen after the performance period is over. So I think this is one of those things that we're going to see how this goes as time unfolds. Optimally, you would keep your data and code in a repository that remains in perpetuity. I honestly, we talk about that. Jenny, I'm sure that you have more thoughts on that, but like, is there any data repository that still exists that existed 30 years ago, right? So I don't know. But there are repositories, the DOI is really a great mechanism for having something that is persistent. But there has to be something when you click on that DOI, there has to be something on a server somewhere that actually links you to that thing. So be prepared for stale links, I guess. Tons of online resources. The FAQ is really great. It's one of these accordion things that is full of really great questions and includes a lot of answers about those questions or links to other resources. I'd encourage you to look at that final NIH policy. And that policy is really where the rubber meets the road in terms of what they're telling you. That's not to say that final policy is not ambiguous. As you read it, you're going to wonder, like, what does this actually mean? And I think that, if the NIH is going to be requiring us to do this, then they should also be providing the staffing to help us understand what they are requiring. There's a few other links. I'm not really going to go through these because you can look at them. There were a few other slides from the NIH that include additional resources. There's some information about informed consent, right? So although the policy encourages us to share data, we have to know if we're doing things that involve sensitive data and informed consent, like where are those lines of what can and cannot or should not be shared. And there's information about sharing for human subjects data. And so again, this is it's beyond the scope of what we can cover today. It's beyond the scope of what I actually know in terms of all of the details, but the information is there. So if you're doing human subjects research, then it's going to be really important that you become aware of what the policies and regulations are. There's also a whole set of policies dealing with the sharing of projects that have used participants from the American Indian or Alaska Native communities. And so if you're involved in any of that kind of research, there's yet more policy and regulation. So everything that I talked about up to now covers all research, but if you're doing research particularly on human subjects or Native communities, then there's other considerations that must be taken into account. That's all I have to cover so far. And I know Jenny has some slides, but if you want to take a few moments to do Q&A, I can answer what I can, or we can have a conversation about anything at this point.
Thanks. Yeah, this is super helpful. I am coming from IH&E, so and we're actually looking at a UO1 right now when a large part of the UO1 is about data sharing. So I thought it might be good for me to hear what's new and everything. I
That's
think
great. So can we come back to you after this is all done and
oh,
give us when we run this workshop the next time, you give us a story from the trenches?
oh yeah, after we get through our submission, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think I'll want to read more about the informed consent piece probably because, like, for example, we have CMS data. So like, can we share that? Seems unclear to me a little bit. So I think that's what I just want to make sure I understand is what we can actually propose that we would be able to share and how we would go about doing that.
Yeah, we're hosting some CMS data on the UW Data Collaborative, and I have gone through, you know, when proposals in the past, when proposals were made for getting the data, they included all the security plans and all that stuff, and so I've read through all of those things, and then I was involved in writing the self-attestation questionnaire for our system. And they're pretty stringent about what can and cannot be shared. So, even a lot of the data that we're getting from them are de-identified, but still, and that's going to be, I think, we can pit the CMS and the NIH against each other, and then they can come up with some kind of agreement about what's possible. But I think it's going to be difficult for us as researchers to kind of know what all of those details are.
Yeah, it seems complicated. And we have a lot of intermediate sort of modeled results that I believe we'll at least be able to share those. But it makes sense that the CMS data has a lot of restrictions. Another thing that makes this UO1 complicated is that one piece of it is that we would also administer pilot projects. And so we would need people outside of UW potentially, like who are our pilot awardees to get access to this data as well. So I don't know, it feels like a complicated issue.
Yeah, definitely super complicated with a U grant versus like an R21 or an R01 where it's just, this little group doing stuff. So be very interested to hear how that goes.
All right, well, should I step into Dryad here?
Yeah, I'm going to stop sharing.
All right, can everybody see that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Dryad and as well as other options for data sharing at the end of a grant. And I say the end because that's typically when folks are ready to do this. And Phil's definitely covered, the process of getting to here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the NIH requirements, and then I'll specifically show Dryad as well as something called the Qualitative Data Repository. So I'm going to skip through some of this. One of the things I wanted to point out is I will put these slides into Phil's slides. They will be available to everyone. There are links that this page is going to take you to a link that's a guide to NIH. It basically duplicates everything Phil just said. One of the things that's nice though is if you need, this is actually a screenshot of a PDF. You need to print this out and like hang it on a wall in your lab or for other people as a reminder. I think it's a really nice little summary of what's included, what needs to be included in the DMSP. This is the second half of it. So again, he covered this, but it was developed as exactly that, just a little reminder to hang in a lab or to put on a screen.
Wait, so sorry, specific, really quick. Sorry, it says loading still. Like I'm just seeing a black screen.
Oh, I don't know. Really? But let's try this again.
When you went to presenter mode, it went to black.
Let's try again. Not helpful. Okay, so let's try again. Yeah, for some reason it's not letting me share. So what I'm just going to do is I'm going to share the screen as is. So it'll be a little smaller, but it should work okay. If you can't see, just let me know. Oop. A little bit, is that visible? Yeah, okay. Okay, so there's the 2-page, or it's a 1-pager, but my 2 screens of it. What I was going to point out is in one of the many links Phil has shared, there is information about where to share, and NIH provides sort of a hierarchy of where people should be putting their data. Certain funding areas have sort of either required repositories or suggested repositories. So I have it in there an example of a national repository for biotechnology information. Their next down in their hierarchy is community-sponsored websites, but really there's a huge number of people who don't have a designated repository, and that's where Dryad comes in. And I'm going to talk about Dryad first, and then a little bit about QDR because they're very similar in some ways. So there are a couple of things that I will provide here as links. I'm not going to walk through the links because that gets pretty tedious, but we do have a checklist for researchers. I think Phil's slides covered a lot of that. I did want to point out that we do provide access from the university provides access to something called DMP Tool. And that is just a text-based system that allows you to put in the information you need to create a DMP. So it walks you through the different sections of the NIH DMP. You fill them in and it generates a 2-page document. I will show that just for a second here because I think it's helpful to see what it looks like. So you can see here I have something called the NIH DMSP test plan. And what I just wanted to show you is what happens is you'll log into this with your UW ID, but this is what this looks like. And it's just each one of those sections Phil was just talking about and what goes in each section is itemized here. So, you can add collaborators, whether they're from UW or elsewhere. And then when you get to the writing plan point, this is the 6 sections that Phil had mentioned. So, there's guidance on the right about what needs to be included in each portion of the DMSP. One of the really nice things about this is it keeps all of your DMSPs in one place. So you've got your UW login and you've got all the data management sharing plans you have worked on will be stored under your login. You can make them publicly available. So if you do want to share them with collaborators here or at another institution, you can. This is especially useful for folks who are maybe reusing data types for multiple studies or have multiple collaborators that are working with similar materials. You can use these as kind of a template for the next time. They're not intended to be sort of I say a template. It's not exactly something that can be cut and pasted in the whole, but you can use the pieces to create your own DMSPs going forward. We find that they're really helpful for people because it provides the information that they need to kind of all in one place to generate the text that they can just plug into a grant. So let me go back here. Oops, too far. So I'm going to talk about our 2 repositories. Dryad's going to be the main one I focus on today. And so a little bit about Dryad itself. It is an external, it's not something we developed here, but it is a membership-based system. So the UW Libraries has paid into this system for research data storage and sharing. And so what that means is the library is covering the fee for any affiliated UW researcher to deposit their data into the Dryad system. It is a cloud-based system. They are affiliated with several different cloud storage systems so that it feels fairly secure. Things are backed up. Although Dryad is hosting the data, if let's say 15 years from now we need to pull all of the University of Washington's data out because it needs to go somewhere else, it would still be something that we retain access to. So technically speaking, it's as persistent as we can get with a data storage system. So it is, generally speaking, designed to handle data. There are other repositories that handle white papers, for example, or preprints and things like that. This is something you can use to store data or share data that is either a standalone research output or that is related to an article or some other written output that you've created. Phil had mentioned digital object identifiers or DOIs. you'll get a DOI for every data set that's deposited into Dryad, which is something that a lot of funders require or a lot of publishers require when you start to connect articles to data. And it's pretty easy to use. It just went online in January of this year. We've had probably 40 or 50 folks deposit data at this point. You log in for the first time with your ORCID ID. I will say just really briefly about ORCID, it's a persistent identifier for an individual. So if you don't have one yet, you'll probably shortly run into a funder or a publisher who either strongly encourages or requires an ORCID ID. Some universities require them of all researchers that are publishing, but UW's not quite there yet. But that is just done the first time when you log into Dryad to disambiguate you from other researchers. And from then forth, you will only have to log in with your UW NID. So it's pretty easy. This is another page that is linked from this presentation. Oh, go ahead.
Can I ask a question? I
Yeah.
should have asked this earlier, but it just came to me based on what you were saying. So I don't know what kind of work you do, Amy at IHME, but I do a lot of demographic estimation in my work, statistical estimation, and we use all sources of data that are not ours, right? Like my data is not something I make, nor is it something I collect. So in terms of data sharing, I have some questions about what exactly that means, right? If we're using data that someone needs to apply for, or even a lot of data I use in some of my research, for instance, is like local administrative data that is downloadable directly via URL from the internet. But I mean, is it on me as a researcher to go through all of their data sharing agreements before am I allowed to put a copy in Dryad, or et cetera?
Yeah, this is a common question, right? So it also extends to folks who have PII in their data, who may need to anonymize data, or in cases where once it's been anonymized, so much context has been stripped out that it loses utility for other researchers, right? So there's no real hard and fast rules around this. We guide people that when they're using data that has, well, I'll back up. Some of it's fairly straightforward. If you're using data that you have been provided a license to use it for your research, there's usually some sort of provision in there about how you're allowed to share. So maybe you're allowed to share the results of your analyses, but you're not allowed to share the data that you acquired from whomever. And I have found so far that when people are creating, I should caveat this with, I'm not at NIH and I don't get to see any of their reviews. My understanding anecdotally is that when folks have data that falls under a license agreement, or just for a variety of complex user agreements cannot be shared publicly, in the DMSP, it is acceptable to say, I cannot share the results of this data for the following reasons. You can state, you've got licenses from 4 different providers. And I have yet to hear from someone that they've gotten dinged for that. Right now, it's still rather new. I know this whole process, this new mandate has only been around for a few months. I think once we get a couple of years of grants submitted, NIH is probably going to have some different kind of guidance, because there's a significant number of researchers who have these kind of limitations around data sharing. So that's kind of my long-winded way of saying the jury's still out on that, but it is acceptable to also not share. They are aware that in many cases it's not acceptable or possible to share the output. Does that answer more or less?
Yeah, and you can totally table this till the end, but another case that I am wondering about, I guess I'm just thinking about how this new data management plan requirement interfaces with lots of other things related to reproducibility. So like in statistics, another thing that we do a lot of is simulation studies. Mm-hmm. And I think the typical open science fair framework is that you should share your code so that someone can re-simulate that data. But is there now some expectation? I can't see any negative to also publishing it on Dryad, but that's like another case that's quite particular to my field that I don't really see where the gray lines or clear lines are.
Yeah, actually, Dryad does accept code for sharing as well. They partner with Zenodo. I mean, that's getting into some of the back end stuff that maybe is irrelevant for you as a depositor, but they fully expect that a lot of folks will need to deposit not just data and metadata, but code or other software that makes what they're depositing useful to others. So this Dryad does accommodate for that. You'll notice under 3 here, under data types, they generally speaking, this kind of Dryad got started for accepting sort of what we'll call traditional data types, but obviously, if you take a broad view of what data is, if you're looking at it in terms of your data is digital research materials, because some people are analyzing photographs or audio or what have you, they take a wide view of what constitutes data, is where I'm going with this. So you can deposit all sorts of data types in here. Generally speaking, there are size limitations where they suggest that data sets are between like 10 and 300 gigabytes each. So each deposit is small. However, they don't have any hard and fast rules if data is over that size. They just have you connect with them individually. So if someone has a terabyte of data as one chunk or in several chunks, they'll handle that individually. And I will say that for me at UW, we have not yet I haven't had to mediate any of that yet. So I don't have any answers. Again, this is still kind of a moving target, especially as we get more and more people who have larger amounts of data that they need to share. So jury's kind of out on exactly what to do with that, but we're still finding that the vast majority of people are kind of in between, 2 gigabytes and a terabyte. It's for most people, this is going to be a very simple process. There will be a few that have some extra work to get their data shared.
I have a quick question on the slide still too, or where it says the data all must be complete. Is that like, let's just say we had a data set where we needed to suppress certain cells, like does that violate the complete issue there?
I think that's a situation where you would put into your DMSP that we have to suppress certain portions of this data, but we will make the non-sensitive portions of the data open to the public. Yeah, period. I'll just stop there. I'll talk a little bit about QDR in a minute too, which is the qualitative data repository as well, which has a few more features that are different than what Dryad provides. So yeah, complete. Open to the public is the second half of that sentence. So the idea that for everything that goes into Dryad, it's basically in the public domain. You can see that all data must be compatible with the Creative Commons 0 license. There's a link to this on the guide. And again, everything I've got here is a link, and you can go do a little more research on these if you want. But that basically means that anyone's able to access your data and then also to reuse your data without any restrictions. I'll talk a little bit again about when you require restrictions in a minute. Dryad does also provide a minimum amount of data curation. And what I mean by that is they're gonna look at your data, they're gonna make sure they don't see anything that should be shared, like PII or other sensitive data. They'll make sure that the data that you shared matches the metadata that you've provided, that the description is correct, et cetera. And then once they've gone through that process, it's live. So the other thing you can do is, you'll see it says select private for peer review if you want to suspend data publication until peer review is complete. A lot of folks do that, right? Frequently a journal publisher will require a DOI prior to publication. So you're not quite ready to publish the data because maybe you're still finishing up or doing some editing, but you need the DOI to be able to submit your article. This is how you get through that process. Anyway, I wanted to just show you this example data set. I was going to show you how to log in, but I've already logged in with ORCID, so I should have maybe videotaped that the first time. It doesn't work for me anymore. This is the example of just a data set. And so you can see here what it looks like. You've got your multiple contributors on the left there, along with publication information, the DOI, and contact information. I had a question yesterday about this and it kind of applies to what you were just asking. If you have a portion of data that cannot be shared, or there's some sort of secondary data set that's more current that you're not ready to share, whatever the case might be, you can put that in the information, which I'll scroll through in a second. And then with your contact information at the front, people can contact you directly if they have questions or want to access something that you can't share readily. You see on the right, there's information. Oh, yeah.
It shows related works to the right, the article, the DOI for that. So is this something that if you are continuing to publish with your data, do you update that yourself?
Yes, this is, you own, well, I don't want to say own, but you have control over your own submissions. And so that's where you could add Article 2, 3, and 4, for example, over time. So it's pretty easy to update. You'll see also there, it's easy to share if you want to do that. The citation information under the abstract and the usage notes, this is where you could have that information I was just mentioning about, there's additional text files that we couldn't share readily, but contact blah, blah, blah to, find out more information. That's where that information could go. They do provide a little bit of metrics on the side there. So you'll see how many people have viewed. That's usually me because I click on this data set all the time. So that's a lot there. But more importantly, you can see how many people have downloaded and cited your data. So that's handy for people who are interested in tracking the sorts of citations that their data might have that's independent of an article. And then keywords, this is a long one, but you'll see here there's a link to the license at the bottom so that people understand that your data is in the public domain. Any questions about that right there?
Yeah, is the citation automatic?
Yeah, yep. You do not have to figure that out on your own. Yeah. Okay, I wanted to talk real briefly about the qualitative data repository. This is also something that's only been live since about February of this year. It's generally speaking, it's another repository. It comes out of Syracuse, and it is geared toward qualitative data that requires potentially more in-depth curation or that requires access controls. So it's kind of the same, you would deposit data, someone would look at it and then give you a DOI and there'd be a landing page. But more specifically is for folks who have the kind of access controls that some of which we just kind of covered with examples. So, if you look here, this under special access, it'll say the restricted data can be accessed, but only by registered QDR users who agree to meet additional conditions stipulated by the researcher. You can see that there's the next bullet down says it's only registered users who receive approval from the researcher who deposited the data can access the data. So this is just an example of another repository you can use that should have, because it's affiliated with an academic institution, should have that kind of persistent longevity that we're looking for in data sharing. But if you have information that maybe is only available to you want to make it available to a smaller subset of healthcare researchers, for example, this is where you might want to put your data because it can't be open access or public domain. That was my brief introduction to the two repositories. I can do a little bit more of a demo if you want. I have also included links here to the little bit more about open science and open research at UW, including some information on reproducibility, which had just been talked about. And then I also linked to this page, which I do want to show. So this is coming out of the Office of Research. We've been working on this. It's the Office of Research and the libraries and a couple other departments that have been trying to keep track of either, most frequently asked questions or updates that apply to UW researchers. We're trying to keep them all on this page so it can be used as a recurring landing page for folks. Oh, you can see I need to take that down. Phil, when you were talking about templates, there was one thing I wanted to show here. So for example, when back in January, like December to February, there were several NIH sites that had information about the components of the plan. So the 6 recommended elements. You'll see the sample language that was provided here was an example. So there was somewhere out in NIH land, it was subsequently taken down. Someone had provided a template information for this section that said, your Office of Research will be monitoring compliance with our plan or the NIH plan, et cetera. And like every institution freaked out. And so there's been a lot of sharing of a template. You'll see in that sample language bullet where it says, you put your name in here, your ORCID ID. It's the PI who's responsible for the oversight of the data management activities and sharing, et cetera. When and if there are other templated pieces of information that UW researchers should be using, it'll get communicated out through various channels, like from the Office of Research, the libraries, et cetera, but it'll always be on this page as well. So I'm going to stop sharing there, but I am more than willing to go back to a page or answer any questions.
Thanks, that was super helpful. I do have just one quick question on that language. Is it, does it have to be the PI, or like we say at ITME, we have sort of a data, administration team, like, does it make sense that it could be them? Or?
Yeah, it's total. Yeah, actually one of the things we at the libraries walk through with folks is figuring out who has data management responsibility in their lab. I know it's not always the PI, so you could say, this person, when with their contact information, is responsible for the data management and sharing for this particular project. It's not required to be the PI, but it's not going to be the Office of Sponsored Programs or anything like that. Yeah.
And then one last question, maybe I missed this, but did you say for the QDR repo, is that free to researchers also?
I'm sorry, can you repeat it?
Is it free? Is there a cost?
Yes. Yeah, in both cases, we currently have a UW funding model for that. So we're paying the cost of deposit. And I know that both of them are also open to individual researchers, maybe who aren't affiliated with UW, and in which case you could, as Phil was saying, say, okay, the deposit here, the fee is $150 or whatever it might be. You could use your grant money for that because it's not ongoing storage. It is a one-time depositing fee in both cases. So just so you know, for folks who might not be affiliated with UW, that would work that way.
Thanks. Yeah, I think we might want to just use our own IH and the internal sort of file structures, but I figured it's good to just know what is all out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, have we covered everything?
I think so. I'm going to give Phil my slides so you can combine it into one presentation, and then they'll share out the link for both. You have the slides and then all the links that were included as well.
Yeah. And then I will post the recording somewhere also.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Just since I didn't register, do you know, are the slides going to be posted on your website, or?
Yeah, I'll probably put them somewhere on the CSDE website.
Okay. Perfect. Yeah, I'd like to be able to just click through some of those links. So.
All right. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
coming.
Yeah.
Have a great day.
You too.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.